His grandfather bet the land he'd fail with that old Farmall. The sealed envelope told the real story. There are bets made in anger that people forget about, and there are bets made in anger that get written down. The difference between those two kinds of bets is the difference between a grudge that fades and a document that waits. Patient, specific, dated, signed by two witnesses who thought at the time that the whole thing would be resolved inside of 3 years, one way or another. It took 11. Part 1. The Kind of Man. Cleat Harmon. You have to understand Cleat Harmon before you can understand anything else about this story. Cleat Harmon was 71 years old in the spring of 1991, and he had been farming the same ground in Cass County, Missouri since he was 19 years old. 52 years on the same land. He'd started with 2 mules and a walking plow on ground his father had broken before him, graduated to a Farmall H in 1948 when the money came available, then a 560 in 1959, then a series of increasingly larger machines as the farm grew and the operation demanded more. By 1991, he was running a pair of John Deere 4240s and a 4440 on just under 400 acres of flat Missouri river bottom, some of the most productive ground in the county. He was not a sentimental man. He was not a patient man, particularly with incompetence, which he defined broadly and applied liberally. He had opinions about the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things, and the wrong way included most of what the younger generation had come up with since roughly 1975. He had 2 daughters who had both married and moved away, a wife named Edna who had long since learned to manage his opinions the way you manage a gate that hangs crooked. You work around it, you don't try to fix it. And he had 1 grandson, Thomas Harmon, Tom to everyone except Cleat, who called him by his full name when he was being formal and boy when he wasn't, was 26 in 1991. He was the son of Cleat's oldest daughter, Marlene, who had married a man from Kansas City and raised Tom in the suburbs, which Cleat considered a fundamental error in judgment that had produced predictable results. Tom had grown up visiting the farm in summers, learning the surface of farming without learning the substance of it, and had spent 4 years at the University of Missouri studying agricultural business, which Cleat also considered a mixed bag at best. What Cleat respected, Tom had come back. After graduation in 1988, after 2 years working for an agricultural lender in Columbia that had given him a view of farming from the banker's side of the desk, Tom had come back to Cass County with the stated intention of farming. He'd rented a small place, 67 acres, modest house, modest barn, ground that was decent but not exceptional, and had announced that he was going to build something. Cleat's response to this announcement had been to wait and see, which in Cleat Harmon's vocabulary was not a neutral position. Waiting to see meant watching for failure, the way a man watches a new fence post for rot, not hoping for it exactly, but not surprised when it comes. Tom's first 2 years were rough, not catastrophically rough. He didn't lose the place, didn't go under on debt, didn't do anything that couldn't be recovered from. But the yields were mediocre, his marketing decisions were off, and he'd made 2 equipment purchases that Cleat, watching from 4 miles away, considered unnecessary and overpriced. An opinion Cleat shared, unbidden, at the family Thanksgiving in 1989, in the particular direct way that Cleat shared opinions about everything. Tom had listened and said nothing. He had learned by then that arguing with Cleat Harmon was like arguing with weather. You didn't change it, you just got wet. In the spring of 1991, Tom made a purchase that broke Cleat's patience entirely. Part 2, the $50 decision and the bet. The tractor was a 1958 Farmall 560 diesel. Not an uncommon machine. International Harvester built a significant number of them between 1958 and 1963. A high-clearance row crop tractor with a 6-cylinder diesel making around 60 horsepower at the drawbar, a step up from the M and H models it was designed to follow. The 560 had a complicated history in farming communities because the early production models, the ones made before IH addressed certain engineering issues in 1961, had a reputation for transmission failures that spread through the farming community, the way bad news always does, faster and further than the manufacturer would have preferred. This particular 560 was from 1958, meaning it was an early production unit. meaning it had the transmission that farmers who knew anything about 560s were wary of. It had been sitting in a fence row on a farm outside of Harrisonville for somewhere between 6 and 8 years. The weeds had grown up through the drawbar. One rear tire was flat and had been flat long enough that the sidewall had cracked on the bottom. The seat was gone, not damaged, just gone, as though it had been removed for some other purpose and never returned. The diesel engine had not run since the mid-1980s at the earliest. Tom paid $350 for it, cash, out of a pocket that didn't have a lot of cash to spare, in April of 1991. He hitched it to a trailer with a rented truck and brought it home to his small farm on a Tuesday afternoon. Cleat found out about it by Thursday. He drove over on Saturday morning, pulled into Tom's lane, and got out of his truck without being invited and walked straight to the barn where the 560 was sitting. He stood and looked at it for a long time. He walked around it slowly. He looked at the cracked tire, the absent seat, the transmission case. He looked at the years of dirt and field debris that had accumulated on every horizontal surface. He looked at Tom. "Do you know what's wrong with the early 560 transmission?" Cleat asked. Tom said he did. "And you bought it anyway." Tom said he'd looked at the case carefully and didn't see any evidence of the specific failure mode. No cracks at the known weak points, no evidence of previous repair at the problematic locations. He thought the transmission on this particular unit might be sound. Cleat's expression at this explanation was the expression of a man listening to someone explain why they jumped off a barn roof by describing the aerodynamic properties of their jacket. It was not a favorable expression. "You paid $350, Cleat said, "for a 560 with a bad reputation, a flat tire with a cracked sidewall, no seat, and an engine that hasn't run in 6 years. On a farm that has no business spending $350 on a tractor that might not run and might not shift if it does run." Tom said he thought it was worth the risk. Cleat was quiet for a long moment. When Cleat Harmon went quiet, the people who knew him well understood that something more considered than usual was being assembled. "Tell you what," Cleat said, "I'll make you a proposition." Tom waited. "You get that thing running and working, actually working in the field, doing field work. Inside of 3 years, I'll sign over the 10-acre parcel on the east side of my north field. The good ground, the creek bottom 10. Tom knew the parcel. Everyone in the family knew that parcel. It was some of the best ground on Cleat's farm, flat, well-drained, dark Missouri bottomland that would grow corn in a drought year. Cleat had been farming it himself since before Tom was born. "And if I don't?" Tom asked. "If you don't," Cleat said, "you sign over whatever equity you've got in this place to me. I'll put it toward the farm for the girls." He meant Tom's mother and aunt. "And you go back to Columbia and work for that bank." Tom was 26 years old. He was standing in a barn that he'd rented with money he'd saved working for people who had told him not to quit his day job, looking at a tractor that most of the serious farmers in the county would have left in that fence row, listening to his grandfather offer him a bet with terms that were, by any reasonable assessment, loaded heavily against him. He said yes. Cleat nodded. He turned and walked back to his truck and drove home without another word. The conversation had taken 9 minutes. Part 3. The envelope. Cleat Harmon was not a man who left things to memory. The following Monday he drove into Harrisonville and sat down with his attorney, a methodical man named Giddens, who had been handling Cass County farm legal work for 30 years and who had processed enough farm disputes to know that family bets made in barns on Saturday mornings needed to be written down carefully, or they turned into family arguments 20 years later. Giddens drew up a simple agreement. It was not complicated. The terms were clear, the timeline was clear, the stakes were clear. 3 years from the date of the agreement. The tractor, identified by its serial number, which Cleat had written down while standing in Tom's barn, had to be running under its own power and performing field work on Tom's farm by that date. 2 witnesses signed. Cleat signed. Tom came in 2 days later and signed. Giddens sealed the executed agreement in an envelope. Cleat took it home and put it in the steel lockbox in the closet of his farmhouse office where he kept the important documents. The deed to the farm, the tile drainage maps, the grain contracts that went back decades. The envelope went in with the others. He told Edna what he'd done. Edna listened, the way she always listened, with the particular patience of a woman who had been married to Cleat Harmon for 47 years and had long since stopped trying to redirect him once he'd decided on a course. "What do you think he'll do?" Edna asked. "I think he'll fail," Cleat said, not with satisfaction, but with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man assessing a situation and reporting what he sees. "That transmission is a known failure. The engine's been sitting too long. He doesn't have the money to do it right, and he doesn't have the experience to do it cheap. He'll spend what he's got trying to make it run, lose the time he should be putting into his actual operation, and be worse off in 3 years than he is now." Edna nodded. "And if he succeeds?" Cleat looked at her. "Then he earned the ground," he said, "and I'll hand it over." That was the thing about Cleat Harmon that people who only saw his temper and his opinions sometimes missed. He was a hard man, but he was a fair one. He didn't make deals he didn't intend to honor. He didn't move goalposts after the fact. The envelope in the lockbox was not a trap. It was a test, and if Tom passed the test, the reward was real. He just didn't think Tom was going to pass it. Part 4. What Tom found in the engine. Tom Harmon was not naive about what he'd gotten himself into. He'd studied the 560 before he bought it. Not the way a collector studies a tractor, not for historical interest or sentimental attachment, but the way an engineer studies a problem. He'd read everything he could find about the model's known issues. He understood the transmission problem specifically. The early 560s had a weakness in the torque amplifier and the final drive housing that, under hard use, could develop cracks at specific stress points. The failure mode was well documented in farming communities across the Midwest, and it had given the 560 a reputation that stuck even to units that had never exhibited the problem. What Tom had done at the farm outside Harrisonville before he bought the machine was spend 2 hours with a flashlight examining every accessible surface of the transmission and final drive. He'd looked at the specific crack locations. He hadn't seen what he was afraid he'd see. That wasn't certainty. He knew the cracks could be internal, could be hairline, could be present without being visible. But it was enough. It was better odds than the tractor's reputation suggested. The engine was a different problem entirely. The IHD 264 six-cylinder diesel that came in the 560 was a solid engine by the standards of its era. Not exceptional, but honest and reliable when maintained. This one had not been maintained in the final years before it stopped running, and the years of sitting hadn't improved it. When Tom finally got it turned over with a breaker bar in his first week, a job that required 2 days of penetrating oil and patience, the compression felt uneven. He did a compression test with a borrowed gauge. 4 cylinders were in acceptable range. 1 was notably low, and 1 was almost nothing. So, at minimum, 1 and probably 2 cylinders needed rings. Possibly more depending on the valve condition, which he couldn't assess until he was further in. He called his former professor at the University of Missouri, a man who had taught agricultural machinery courses and who had the particular kind of practical knowledge that comes from decades of watching farm equipment be maintained and abused and repaired, and described what he'd found. The professor listened and said it sounded like a ring job on at minimum 2 cylinders, probably all 6 while he had it apart, with valve work likely on the low ones. Tom asked what a shop would charge. The professor gave him a number that Tom did not repeat to anyone. Tom did it himself. It took him the better part of 4 months, working evenings and weekends around the demands of his actual farming operation. He pulled the head in June, found worn rings throughout and 2 valves that needed grinding, ordered parts from a dealer in Kansas City who gave him a small discount for buying a full set of rings and bearings at once, and did the machine work himself where he could, and took the head to a shop for the valve grinding because that required equipment he didn't own. The engine was back together and running by mid-September of 1991. Rough at first, new rings needed time to seat, and the injectors were in marginal condition. But running. He drove it around the yard, listening. The sound was right. The smoke cleared as the rings seated. By October it was running cleanly. He had not touched the transmission. He was afraid to, and he was right to be afraid. Not because he couldn't do the work, but because the transmission was a known risk, and he had learned enough by then to understand that known risks deserve respect. He drove it carefully that fall, never pushing it into situations that would stress the drivetrain beyond what was necessary. He learned the machine's particular character, the way it wanted to be shifted, the RPM range where it was happiest, the conditions under which he should use the torque amplifier, and the conditions where he should not. The transmission held. Part 5. The years of proving. The agreement gave Tom 3 years from the date of signing in the spring of 1991. He had the engine running by the fall. In the spring of 1992, he put the 560 to work in earnest. He pulled the cultivator with it. He pulled the grain wagon. He used it for the secondary tillage passes where the ground was already broken and the work was moderate. He learned over that first working season what the machine could and couldn't be asked to do, and he organized his operation around those capabilities the way a good farmer organizes around what's actually available to him rather than what he wishes he had. The yields in 1992 were better than 1991. Not because of the 560 specifically. A tractor is a tool, and tools don't grow crops, they only support the people who do. But the 560 had freed up the machine hours on his other equipment, an aging Ford 5000 that was his primary tractor, and the better distribution of workload across 2 tractors meant that timing improved. Planting went in when it should. Cultivation happened when it needed to. The crop responded to better management. Cleat drove past his fields occasionally that summer. Tom saw him once, slowed on the road, watching the 560 pull the cultivator through the standing corn. Cleat didn't stop. He didn't wave. He drove on. Tom understood this. Cleat wasn't there to be encouraging. He was there to assess. Tom didn't need encouragement from Cleat. He needed to do the work. 1993 was a hard year for most farmers in Missouri. It was the year of the Great Flood, the year the Missouri and Mississippi rivers left their banks and stayed out for months, the year that farming in the bottoms became a matter of salvage and survival rather than crop production. Tom's rented ground was not in the floodplain. He'd had the luck or the judgment to rent ground with good elevation, and he came through 1993 better than many of his neighbors, though not without difficulty. Corn prices were complicated by market disruptions from the flood damage across the region. He made decisions in the summer and fall of 1993 that were not obviously right at the time, but turned out to be right enough. Cleat's farm, on higher ground, came through 1993 intact. But watching his neighbors and the wider community deal with that year softened something in Cleat that he didn't acknowledge openly. The flood was the kind of event that reminded even confident men that farming happened in a world that didn't consult your opinions before making its decisions. He didn't say this to Tom. He didn't say it to anyone. But Edna, who watched him carefully the way she always had, noticed a slight adjustment in how he talked about Tom's operation at the dinner table. Less certainty. More quiet. 1994 was a recovery year for the region and a good year for Tom. The crop came in well. He marketed it better than he had in previous years. The time at the agricultural lender had given him tools for thinking about marketing that were paying dividends now, the way education usually pays, slowly and without announcement. He put money aside that year. Not much, but some. The first year he'd had anything left over. The 560 ran through the 1994 season without a transmission problem. 2 years of field work, seasons of reasonable use, and the transmission had not failed. Tom had by this point made his peace with the machine. He knew its history and its reputation, and he'd watched it prove the reputation wrong. 1 field season at a time. The 3-year deadline from the agreement arrived in the spring of 1994. Part 6. Cleat drives over. On a Tuesday morning in April of 1994, Cleat Harmon drove the 4 miles from his farm to Tom's place. He drove slowly, which was not his habit. Cleat normally drove the way he did everything, with deliberate efficiency. But he drove slowly that morning. He turned into Tom's lane at 7:30 in the morning, parked, and got out. The farm was quiet in the early April way. Cool, damp, the fields not yet ready for work, the equipment lined up along the barn wall waiting for the season. The 560 was there. Still rough-looking. Tom hadn't painted it, hadn't restored it, hadn't done anything to it that wasn't strictly necessary to keep it working. It looked like what it was, a working farm tractor that had been repaired and used. Tom came out of the barn when he heard the truck. He was carrying a coffee thermos and wearing his work coat. He looked at his grandfather and waited. Cleat walked to the 560. He looked at it for a long time. He put his hand on the hood. The engine was warm, which meant Tom had run it recently. He walked around it slowly, the same circuit he'd walked in 1991, looking at the same machine through 3 years of added use. "Has it shifted right?" Cleat asked. "Every time," Tom said. "Transmission never gave you trouble?" "No." Cleat nodded. He was looking at the tractor. His hands were in his coat pockets. After a long moment, he said, "You want to start it?" Tom started it. The D264 diesel turned over and caught on the third compression stroke, settled into its characteristic thrum, the exhaust stack putting up a thin smoke that cleared in half a minute. The sound was solid and steady. Cleat listened to it the way a man listens to something he knows. He'd run a 560 himself in the late 50s and early 60s before he moved up to larger machines. He knew what a healthy one sounded like. He listened for 2 minutes. Then he said, "Shut it off." Tom shut it off. Cleat walked back to his truck. Tom thought for a moment he was going to leave without saying anything. Instead, Cleat opened the truck door, reached across the seat, and came back with a plain white envelope. It was not the original envelope from Giddens' office. That one was still in the lockbox. This one was different, same size, sealed, with nothing written on the outside. Cleat held it out to Tom. Tom took it. "The bet's settled," Cleat said. "I'll have Giddens draw up the quit claim on the creek bottom 10. You'll have it by the end of the month." Tom looked at the envelope in his hand. "What's this?" "Read it when I'm gone," Cleat said. He got in his truck. Tom stood in his farm lane holding the envelope and watched his grandfather back out and drive away. The tractor sat behind him in the cool April morning, engine ticking as it cooled. He went inside and sat at his kitchen table and opened the envelope. Part 7. What was in the envelope? There were 2 pages inside, both handwritten on Cleat's stationery, plain white paper with the farm's rural route address printed at the top in plain type. The first page was a letter. Tom read it twice before he understood what he was reading. Then he read it a third time. The letter was dated 3 years earlier, the same week as the original agreement. Cleat had written it on the day he'd come home from the barn where the bet was made, before he'd driven to Giddens' office, before the document was drawn up. The letter said this: he had not made the bet because he thought Tom would fail. He had made it because he needed Tom to have something worth fighting for. He had watched Tom's first 2 years of farming with the quiet attention that Cleat always paid to things that mattered to him, which included more than Tom knew his grandson's operation. And he had seen ability that was real and ambition that was real, and a failure of the kind that comes not from incompetence, but from not yet having sufficient reason to push past comfortable. The 560 purchase had not surprised him as much as he'd let on. He'd recognized immediately that Tom had looked at that machine and seen something in it. The wrong tractor, bought for the wrong reasons, is an impulsive purchase. The right tractor, bought because you understood something about it that the crowd had decided made it worthless. That was a different thing. Cleat had thought about it for 2 days after the barn conversation, and he'd concluded that Tom might actually be right about the transmission. He wasn't going to say that to Tom. Not then. Not in the barn. What Tom needed, the letter said, was not encouragement. Encouragement was what you gave a child learning to walk. Tom was not a child, and the farm was not a playroom. What Tom needed was a real consequence. Something that would cost him enough that the option of giving up became genuinely painful. The equity in his rented place was not a fortune, but it was everything he had, and the threat of losing it to a family account while being sent back to desk work was the kind of consequence that would either produce the result Cleat wanted or confirm the assessment he didn't want to have to make. He had written the letter immediately after the bet, he said, because he wanted there to be a record of his actual thinking. Not for Tom to see at the time, because that would have defeated the purpose, but for afterward. He had sealed it and put it in the lockbox with the agreement. Win or lose, he wanted Tom to know what the bet had really been about. The second page was different. It was a list, 11 items, numbered. Each one was a piece of specific advice, not general wisdom, not philosophy, but specific operational guidance about the farm. about the creek bottom 10 acres Tom was about to receive, about the ground's drainage patterns and the tile that had been laid in 1967 and needed checking every few years, about the soil variation in the northwest corner that made the fertility program different there than the rest of the field, about the neighbor to the east who would want to fence share and was honest about it, about the marketing window that historically worked best for that ground's corn. It was the kind of information that takes decades to accumulate, the kind of knowledge that lives in a man who has farmed ground long enough to know its moods, its weak points, its tendencies, the kind of thing you cannot find in a soil report or a production record. It has to come from someone who was there. Cleat had written all of it down for Tom. Tom sat at the kitchen table for a long time with those 2 pages in his hands. Part 8, The Ground Itself. The quitclaim deed arrived from Giddens' office before the end of April, as Cleat had promised. 10 acres of Missouri Creek bottom, some of the most productive ground in the county, added to Tom's rented base. He farmed it carefully that first year, following the notes on the second page of Cleat's letter with the attention they deserved. He soil tested the northwest corner separately, as the letter advised, and found the fertility variation Cleat had described. He checked the tile outlet and found it partially obstructed. A beaver dam on the creek had backed up sediment into the tile line. He cleared it, which improved the drainage on the bottom third of the field by a margin he could see in the soil moisture within a week. The ground produced. Not magically, not dramatically. It was good ground being farmed by a man who was getting better at farming, and the combination of those 2 things produced results that were above the county average without being exceptional. But above average ground, farmed with improving competence, compounds. It is not a dramatic thing year by year. It is a dramatic thing decade by decade. The neighbor to the east, a quiet man named Sorrell, who had been farming beside Cleat's field for 20 years, came by that fall and introduced himself and raised the fence-sharing conversation that Cleat's letter had anticipated. Tom handled it the way the letter suggested, and the arrangement they arrived at was fair and has been maintained without friction for 30 years. Tom did not tell Sorrell about the letter. He did not tell anyone about the letter except his mother, Marlene, who cried when he described it to her on the phone, and his wife, Diane, who came into the picture in 1996 and understood immediately why the 2 handwritten pages were kept in a fireproof box, separate from the other important documents. Part 9, The Later Reckoning. Cleat Harmon died in the winter of 2003, 12 years after the bet in the barn. He was 83 years old. He had farmed until he was 79, when his hips finally declined to participate, and had spent the last 4 years watching from the window in the truck seat while the operation transitioned to Tom, who had been effectively running it since the late 1990s. He died the way men who have worked hard and lived straight tend to die. In his own house, in his own bed, surrounded by people who knew him, without a great deal of drama. He had made his arrangements in advance and left clear instructions about everything, because he was Cleat Harmon, and that was how he did things. The farm, in his will, went to Tom. Not to his daughters. They were provided for separately, generously, in a way that Cleat had arranged quietly over the years. But the farm itself, the 400 acres of Missouri River bottom that he had assembled and maintained over 50 years, went to his grandson. Marlene and her sister understood this. They had been told years earlier, and they did not contest it. They understood that the farm was not an asset to be liquidated and divided. It was a thing that needed someone to be responsible for it, and they knew who that someone was. Tom stood in the farmyard after the funeral, the same yard where the 560 had been parked when Cleat first looked at it, the same lane where Cleat had backed out and driven away after handing over the envelope, and tried to understand the weight of what he'd inherited. 412 acres. The 560 was still in his barn 3 miles away, still running. The transmission had never failed. He'd put it through 13 years of field work, and it had given him no reason to regret the $350 or the bet that had followed. He used it for the lighter work on his own place and loaned it occasionally to a neighbor who needed a second tractor during harvest. It started and ran and worked, which was all it had ever been asked to do. Part 10. What Tom tells people. When people ask Tom Harmon about the bet, And people do ask because the story has been in the community for 30 years now, passed around and polished the way local stories get. He tells it straight. He tells them about the $560 in the fence row, and the $350, and the barn on a Saturday morning, and the 9-minute conversation. He tells them about the 3 years of engine work, and careful use, and watching the transmission either fail or not fail. He tells them about the April morning in 1994 and the envelope. What he doesn't tell them, or doesn't lead with anyway, is the part that changed his understanding of everything. He had thought for 3 years that the bet was about the tractor. That Cleat had seen a foolish purchase and had decided to attach a consequence to it, the way a man of Cleat's character would, because leaving Tom to learn without stakes was not how Cleat operated. He had been wrong about that, not about the mechanism. The bet was real, and the stakes were real, but about what it was actually for. The bet was never about whether Tom could fix a tractor. Cleat knew, or suspected strongly, that Tom could fix the tractor. The bet was about what fixing the tractor would do to Tom, what 3 years of working on a problem that mattered, under real pressure, with something he'd built at stake, would produce in a 26-year-old man who had ability, but hadn't yet had sufficient reason to push it all the way out to its edge. It produced a farmer, not a hobbyist, not a manager, not an operator of inherited assets. A farmer, someone who understood the ground and the machines and the markets and the risk and the long-time horizon, someone who had been tested and had not failed the test, someone who could take 11 items of specific operational knowledge written by an old man and apply them correctly to land he'd just received. The tractor was the catalyst. The bet was the pressure. The envelope was the explanation. Tom has carried those 2 pages in the fireproof box for 30 years. He has read them perhaps 100 times. The handwriting is clear and distinct. Cleat's particular script, the same hand that signed equipment contracts and tile drainage easements, and 100 years of Cass County farming history. Part 11. The 560. Now the Farmall. 560 diesel is still at Tom's farm. It is 35 years older than when he bought it, which puts its age at somewhere around 66 years old at time of telling. The engine, rebuilt by Tom's hands in the summer and fall of 1991, has since been rebuilt a second time in 2008, when the rings were genuinely worn from the accumulated hours. The transmission has never been touched internally. Whatever Tom saw in that case in the field outside Harrisonville in the spring of 1991, he was right. The specific failure points of the early 560 transmission are unmarked on his unit. Either the manufacturing variation put this one in the sound portion of the production run, or the previous owner had used it in a way that never stressed the weak points. Whatever the reason, the transmission is still the transmission it left the factory with. His son, a young man named Garrett, who is 23 and farming alongside his father, drove the 560 last week to move some grain wagons around the yard. He mentioned afterward that the clutch felt a little heavy. Tom said he'd look at the clutch adjustment. He has not yet. He will. The letter is still in the fireproof box. Garrett knows about it. Tom showed it to him when he was old enough to understand what it said. Garrett read it twice and was quiet for a while, and then asked his father what he thought Cleat had actually believed, going into the bet, whether he'd thought Tom would make it or not. Tom said he thought Cleat had been genuinely uncertain, that the letter proved Cleat thought Tom had real ability, but ability and execution are different things, and Cleat had been a man who'd seen enough ability fail under insufficient pressure that he couldn't simply trust it. Garrett thought about that. Then he said, "So the bet was the pressure." Tom said that was right. Garrett thought about it some more. He has a quality that his great-grandfather would have recognized and respected. He thinks before he speaks, and when he speaks it tends to be accurate. So the whole thing, Garrett said, the tractor, the 3 years, the envelope, it was a lesson he'd written down before you'd even started. Tom said that was the best way he'd ever heard it put. Epilogue. What gets written down there is a lockbox in the farmhouse office of the Harmon farm in Cass County, Missouri. It is a steel box, fireproof, with a 3-number combination that Tom has had memorized since 1994. Inside it are the documents you'd expect: the deeds, the tile maps, the equipment records, the things that a farm requires in order to exist as a legal and operational entity. and there are two other things. One is the original agreement from Giddens' office, the document with the signatures and the witnesses and the terms of the bet, dated in the spring of 1991 and never contested. It has the serial number of the 560 written in Giddens' careful hand, which was the thing that made it specific and real and unargumentable. The other is the envelope. The plain white envelope with nothing written on the outside, containing 2 pages in Cleat Harmon's handwriting, the letter and the list. Tom has had the letter copied twice, once for Garrett, once for the family archive, but he keeps the original. He doesn't look at it often anymore. He doesn't need to. The things it says have been running in the background of his farming decisions for 30 years, the way good advice runs in the background of a life once it's been properly absorbed, not consulted consciously every day, but present, informing the small decisions that add up to the way a man does things. The 560 starts in the morning when it's asked to. The ground produces. The sun is learning. Cleat Harmon bet his best 10 acres against his grandson's future, and he won the bet he was actually trying to win. That's the story. All of it. End. Expanded. Part 4. Continuation. The education Cleat didn't know he was watching. Tom Harmon kept a notebook that first year. It was a plain composition notebook, the kind that cost $1 at the hardware store in Harrisonville, and he wrote in it almost every evening after supper. Not a diary. He wasn't given to introspection of that particular kind, but a technical record. What he'd done to the 560 each day, what he'd found, what had worked and what hadn't, the parts he'd ordered and what they'd cost, the measurements he'd taken on the cylinder bores, the compression readings before and after the ring job, the fuel consumption figures once the engine was running. He also wrote down questions, things he didn't know and needed to find out. He'd call the professor in Columbia, or drive to the library in Harrisonville, or talk to a retired IH mechanic named Pruitt, who lived 2 miles down the road and who had spent 30 years in an IH dealership service department before age and bad knees retired him to a small house and a large shop where he still fixed things for neighbors who asked correctly. Pruitt was the most valuable resource Tom found that first year. Not because Pruitt did the work. He was careful about that, careful not to do what Tom could and should learn to do himself, but because he explained the why behind the what. The reason the 560's rings wore the way they wore. The reason the early diesel injection system needed specific attention to the bleed sequence. The particular way the IH torque amplifier wanted to be engaged under load versus light use. The driving technique that put the least stress on the components that were the known weak points of the transmission. "You want to understand the machine," Pruitt told him once, standing in Tom's barn watching him work. "Not just fix it. A man who understands a machine can keep it running with less than a man who just knows which parts to replace." Tom wrote that down too. He didn't show the notebook to Cleat. He didn't show it to anyone. It was a working document, not a presentation. But the discipline of keeping it, the habit of recording what he was learning in a form that required him to be precise about it, built something in his thinking that carried forward into everything else he did on the farm. The marketing records he kept from 1993 onward were better than his early records because of the notebook habit. The soil fertility records he started keeping on the creek bottom 10 in 1994 were better because of the notebook habit. The operational log he kept on all his equipment was better because of the notebook habit. Cleat never saw the notebook, but he saw the results of the habit, in the improving precision of how Tom managed his operation, in the way questions Tom asked shifted from general to specific over the 3 years of the bet. The questions got better. That was what Cleat noticed. A man whose questions get better is a man who is learning, and learning that shows in better questions is real learning, not the performed kind. He didn't tell Tom this. He filed it. Expanded. Part 5. Continuation. The community watches. Small farming communities in Missouri watch their own with the same attention they give the weather. Not passive, but tracking, noting, updating the forecast as new information comes in. The bet between Cleat Harmon and his grandson was known inside of a week. Not because either of them told people. Cleat certainly didn't talk about it, and Tom had the sense not to. But because Giddens had a secretary who knew everyone in town, and because the two witnesses who'd signed the document were local men who had families who talked. By the time the agreement was a month old, the broad outlines were common knowledge in the area. Most people's assessment aligned with Cleat's stated position. The 560 was a known quantity. The transmission reputation had been established over 30 years of failed units across the Midwest, and the fact that Tom had bought one without immediate plans to rebuild it struck most of the experienced farmers in the area as a gamble at best. The prevailing opinion, delivered in feed stores and equipment yards and the parking lots after church, was that Tom was a young man with more education than experience, and that the education hadn't quite caught up to the gap yet. Pruitt, who heard the opinion circulating and had his own view of it, kept that view to himself. He had seen Tom's notebook by then. Tom had shown him specific entries to get the old mechanic's verification of his measurements. And Pruitt understood what the notebook represented in a way that the feed store opinions did not. The neighbor 2 farms over, a man named Alderton, who had farmed beside Cleat for decades and respected him more than most people in the county, came by Tom's place in the fall of 1991, ostensibly to borrow a piece of equipment, but actually to look at the situation. He walked around the 560, which was outside the barn, getting an oil change, and asked Tom a few questions about it in the indirect way that experienced farmers ask questions when they don't want to seem too interested. Tom answered the questions directly. He described what he'd found in the engine, what he'd done about it, and what his plan was going forward. He described the transmission situation accurately, the known risk, the evidence he'd found or not found, his plan to use the machine carefully until he understood it better. Alderton nodded. He asked one more question. What had Tom paid for it? Tom told him. $350. Alderton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's about what a running 560 with a good transmission is worth for parts, if nothing else." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment. But it was an acknowledgement that the math hadn't been as insane as the community consensus suggested. He didn't tell anyone in the community this, but he went home and mentioned to his wife that the Harmon boy might be smarter than people were giving him credit for, and his wife mentioned it to her sister. And by a route that such things always find, it came back to Cleat, who received the information without visible reaction. Internally, Cleat was making adjustments, not to his expectation of the outcome. He still thought Tom was more likely to fail than succeed on pure odds, but to his assessment of Tom's reasoning. The boy had thought it through. The purchase hadn't been impulsive in the way Cleat had assumed. That was worth something. Not everything, but something. Expanded. Part 6. Continuation. The morning in detail. The April morning in 1994, when Cleat drove over, deserves more description than it got, because the details of it are the details that mattered to Tom for the rest of his life. It was a Tuesday because Cleat always did his important business on Tuesdays. This was a habit he'd had for as long as Tom could remember. Monday you recovered from the weekend and planned the week. Wednesday onward you were in the middle of things, but Tuesday was when you made the calls and drove the drives and sat down with the lawyer or the banker or the seed dealer and did the things that required clear thinking and no distractions. Tom didn't know if Cleat had arrived at this deliberately or if it had simply evolved, but he'd noticed the pattern years before the morning it became significant. Cleat was wearing his good work coat, not his best coat, which he wore to church and the occasional funeral, but the one step below that, the heavy canvas coat with the fleece lining that he kept cleaner than his everyday barn coat. Tom noticed this. It meant the visit was not casual. He drove a 1988 Chevy pickup that he'd bought used in 1990 and maintained with the same attention he gave everything else he owned. It was clean. The tires were good. It started in cold weather, which was the primary qualification Cleat required of any vehicle. He parked it in Tom's lane with the same automatic precision he parked everything. Square to the barn, not blocking anything, leaving room for another vehicle to pass. He got out slowly. His hips were not yet the problem they would become, but they were a presence by then, the beginning of a conversation between his body and the years of work he'd asked it to do. He didn't acknowledge the slowness. He walked to the 560. Tom watched from the barn doorway. He had not gone out immediately because he understood without being told that Cleat needed a minute with the machine before he needed a minute with Tom. The machine was the subject. Tom was secondary. Cleat put his hand on the hood after the first circuit around the tractor. This was the tell. Tom had seen Cleat do this with other equipment over the years, at farm sales and at neighbors' places and in his own yard. When Cleat put his hand on something's hood, he was feeling for the warmth of recent operation, checking whether the machine was being used or merely present. The 560 was warm because Tom had run it that morning to move a wagon, which was honest use and not preparation for Cleat's visit. Cleat's hand stayed on the hood for maybe 5 seconds. Then he walked back around to the front and looked at the engine cowl and then at the transmission housing and then at the rear axle. He was looking at specific things. Not the general condition, he'd assessed that in the first circuit, but the specific points of the 560's known vulnerabilities. He was checking his own understanding against the evidence in front of him. When he asked Tom to start the engine, it wasn't a request. It was an instruction in the form of a question, which was how Cleat gave instructions when he was being what passed for polite. Tom started it without comment. Cleat listened for 2 full minutes, not 2 approximate minutes. Tom looked at the clock on the barn wall and watched both hands. Exactly 2 minutes. Long enough to hear the engine through its warm-up cycle, through the point where a problem in the upper cylinders would begin to show itself in the sound, through the point where the injection timing could be heard to be right or wrong. Cleat knew what he was listening for, and he listened for all of it. He heard nothing wrong, because there was nothing wrong. Shut it off. And then the envelope. Expanded. Part 9. Continuation. The farm. Tom built. The farm that Tom Harmon farms today is not the 67-acre rented place he started with in 1990. It is not the combined holding of the rented ground, plus the creek bottom 10 that Cleat signed over in 1994. It is 431 acres of Cass County, Missouri farmland, Cleat's original 412, plus the 19 acres Tom had assembled on his own before the inheritance, integrated into a single operation that Tom manages with his son Garrett and a part-time hired man during the busy seasons. He farms corn and soybeans primarily, rotating on a schedule that takes into account the specific characteristics of each field, information assembled partly from the soil records he's kept since 1994, and partly from the operational knowledge Cleat encoded in that second page of the letter. The northwest corner of the creek bottom 10 still gets a different fertility program than the rest of the field. The tile is checked every 4 years now, on a schedule Tom set after the first time he cleared the beaver dam obstruction and saw how much difference the drainage made. The farm has no debt. Tom paid off the last note in 2011, 3 years after a particularly strong marketing sequence he'd executed in 2008 that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with the disciplines he'd developed over 20 years of careful record-keeping. He is the kind of farmer who is not often written about in agricultural magazines because his success is not dramatic. It is the product of consistent good judgment compounding over a long time, which is less interesting as a story than a single brilliant decision or a fortunate discovery, but is more useful as a model. He still has the notebook from 1991, the composition notebook from the hardware store, the dollar notebook where he recorded everything he learned fixing the 560 in that first difficult year. It is in the fireproof box with the agreement and the envelope. It has not been consulted in years. It doesn't need to be. Its contents are in the habits that built from it, which are in the farm that grew from those habits, which is in the ground that will outlast all of them. This is how things that matter get passed down. Not in speeches or ceremonies or dramatic moments of recognition, though those have their place. They get passed down in composition notebooks and sealed envelopes and the specific 11 items of knowledge that an old man writes down about ground he's farmed for 50 years, addressed to the grandson he's decided, on available evidence with honest uncertainty, deserves to receive them. The 560 starts in the morning. The ground produces. The sun is learning. That's all there is to it. That's everything. Expanded. Part 7. Continuation. Reading the letter. Twice more. Tom Harmon has a habit of understatement that he comes by honestly. Cleat Harmon was not a demonstrative man, and the trait passed through blood and proximity both. So when he describes reading that letter for the first time at his kitchen table on that April morning in 1994, he says he sat there for a while and thought about it. What he means by that, if you press him, is closer to this. He sat at that table for an hour and 15 minutes without moving except to turn the pages, and he read the letter 4 times and the list 3 times, and then he sat with both pages face down on the table and looked at the window that faced the barn and the lane where Cleat's truck had backed out and disappeared, and he thought about 11 years of his own life, from the summers on the farm as a child to the classroom in Nao, Columbia, to the desk at the agricultural lender, to the rented ground and the rough first years, and the Saturday morning in the barn, and 3 years of cold mornings and careful decisions, and a tractor that had been dismissed by every experienced farmer in the county and had not failed him once. He thought about what it meant that Cleat had written the letter before the bet was even drawn up, before the document, before Tom had signed anything or committed to anything. Cleat had gone home from that barn, sat down, and written 2 pages that explained exactly what he was doing and why, and then sealed them and put them away, not knowing for certain that he'd ever give them to Tom. He had been planning for Tom's success while publicly predicting his failure, not because he was dishonest. Cleat was never dishonest, but because the 2 things were not contradictory. You could genuinely believe that failure was the more probable outcome and still plan for success, because planning for success costs nothing and ignoring it costs everything if it arrives. That was the Cleat Harmon that the feed store opinions had never quite seen, the one who ran the numbers on every outcome and prepared for each of them with equal seriousness. Tom also thought about the 11 items on the second page. He read them again. He had farmed beside this ground for years without knowing any of what was written there. The tile line, the northwest corner, the neighbor sorrel, and how to handle the fence conversation. Knowledge that had been sitting inside his grandfather's head all that time, available but unshared, because the conditions for sharing it hadn't existed until that April morning. There is a version of farming wisdom that says you should give your knowledge freely, share what you know, help the next generation without making them earn it. Cleat Harmon did not subscribe to that version. He subscribed to the version that says, knowledge earned is knowledge kept, that a man who receives operational wisdom before he has the capacity to use it correctly will misuse it or not use it at all, and that the only reliable way to ensure that important things get passed down correctly is to wait until the receiver is ready and then give everything at once. Tom had been ready since April of 1994. Cleat had been waiting since the spring of 1991. The 3 years in between were not wasted time. They were the making of the readiness. He folded the pages carefully. He put them back in the envelope. He kept the envelope at the kitchen table for the rest of that day in his eyeline while he went about the work of the farm. That evening he put it in the steel lockbox where it has lived ever since, beside the agreement that formalized the bet, beside the deed to the 10 acres that the bet produced. He called his mother that evening. She cried, as mentioned. He didn't cry. He's his grandfather's grandson in that way. But he was quieter than usual for the rest of the week. And Diane, who was not yet in the picture but would be within 2 years, would later say that the Tom Harmon she met in 1996 seemed like a man who had recently come to understand something important and had not yet finished understanding it. That's probably accurate. Some things take longer than a week.